Guys, yeah, you got to start the streaming, right? All right. So for those of you that just got here, that's the Bay City fireworks last night. Was a monster display. I've only been there a couple of times, but this one was really nice. Just thought I'd share. There are many reasons a couple decides to get a divorce. But one study showed that 60% of marriages fail because one or both of the partners were unfaithful. This article said that infidelity was often cited as a critical turning point in a deteriorating relationship. In fact, it was often cited as a critical turning point, and that most often was the final straw that was cited for the breakup. Another study showed that premarital cohabitation and premarital pregnancy and a religious affiliation, as well as this infidelity, were among the most prominent factors. When the Bolsheviks came into power in Russia in 1917, they regarded the family, like every other bourgeoisie institution, with fierce hatred, and therefore they set out with a will to destroy the marriages in general. There we go. In an article called "The Russian Effort to Abolish Marriage," it says that a law was passed which made divorce a matter of a few minutes, to be obtained at the request of either partner in the marriage. Chaos was the result. Men took wives and changing wives with the same zest that they displayed in the consummation of recently restored 40% vodka. Wherever the marriage vows are taken lightly and the notion of God's ideal family is dismantled, society begins to break down. In Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we see God's miraculous creation. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, Adam, God's newly formed image, was given the task of subduing and having dominion over God's creation. He was told to name the animals, and he was given more food than he could possibly eat, plus an endless water supply. What else could a man ask for? But as the first image of God was naming all the animals, we read in Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 20, that there was no suitable helper for Adam. It reads, "So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man, and he said, 'This is bone,' and the man said, 'This is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. I shall call her woman, for she has been taken out of me.' And that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united with his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were naked, and they felt no shame." In that very moment, the family unit was established. Older versions of the Bible translations say that the man is to leave and cleave. Leave includes words such as commit oneself, to relinquish, to leave alone or to forsake others. And the word cleave means to cling or adhere or to stick to, like superglue. And then to become one, or to become one flesh, to be joined, to hold fast to each other. Now let's look at what happens immediately after this passage. In chapter 3, at the very beginning, it says, "Now the serpent was more subtle than any other wild creature that the Lord had made. It was then that Eve was tempted and Adam followed suit. It was then, after they had defied God, that they noticed that they were naked and they were ashamed, so they tried to hide themselves. And it was then, after being caught, that we see the first marriage spat. Genesis chapter 3, verse 12. Adam says to God, after he asked him a question, he says, "It was the woman that you put here with me. She gave me some of the fruit." Can you imagine that night? "That I should eat." And when God turned to Eve, of course, she had a blame also. She blamed the serpent and said, "He deceived me, so I ate." And it was in that moment that the family unit was first tarnished. The first couple saw each other in a different light once sin entered the world, and I think that passes down to us even today. But it was not supposed to be this way from the beginning. The literal translation of Genesis chapter 2, verse 18 is, "I will make for him a helper as in front of him," or according to what is in front of him. This phrase, "as in front of him," occurs only in verse 18 and in verse 20 in Genesis. It suggests that what God created was supposed to correspond perfectly to the man. This was, thus, this newest creation was neither to be superior nor inferior. The creation of this helper would form one half of a matching set. The scripture goes on to say that the two shall be one. The literal meaning of this word is to be, or of the word be is to become or shall come to pass. This phrase is used many times in Genesis and often implies a process leading to something that will happen. I think that the full meaning of leave and cleave and becoming one is a process. And it's a process which takes a long-term commitment on the part of both parties to make it happen. Marriage at its root level is a contract or a covenant between a man and a woman. Not many look at marriage institution this way anymore, but at its root, this is what it is. I recently read an article titled, "What if I treated marriage more like a contract, like it is?" That was the name of the article. And the author was somebody that had been divorced a couple of times, and he was looking into why, and he came to those conclusions. He was questioning why he and most couples, how they look at marriage and why they fail. And in the article, he said, the word contract is used to describe both marriage and business, with one big difference. We go into marriage with a naive yes, whatever, forever, love conquers all, and yet we enter into our relationships with our cell phone companies or with multi-page documents. And we start a relationship with the mortgage company by having to read and sign about 30 pages. In other words, what he's saying is something as important as the marriage contract is not taken as seriously as any other kind of contract. I don't know if anybody in here has ever seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof. One of my favorite scenes in there is where Tevye walks up to his wife and says, "Do you love me?" And her response is, "Do I what?" They were put together as a young couple, knowing that they were going to be compatible, and the parents said, "You're getting married," and they did. And all of this was being challenged because his daughters were going out and finding love instead. So he wanted to find that, whether he had that relationship with his wife. And they have a song and a little bit back and forth, and finally at the end she says, "I guess I do, but it really doesn't really matter because, we're married anyway." It's a different way of looking at marriage, but who knows if it's the right way or not. They had a contract and they stayed with each other no matter what. The Bible is telling us that we are to leave, we are to cleave, and we are to become one when we are married. We are to become one physically, we are to become one in our commitment to each other, and we are to become one in our life's goals. Therefore, as long as both parties remain true to this contract, then betrayal is not going to be an option. Yet betrayal comes too often to many marriages in the form of adultery. Adultery is marital infidelity. The primary purpose of the marriage commitment is to protect the marriage. Adultery is wrong because it violates the trust between a husband and a wife. It breaks the marriage covenant. In the civil aspect of the law of Moses, the penalty for adultery was very severe. Leviticus chapter 20. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, then both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. Douglas Wilson puts it this way: "A man who will betray his wife will betray anyone. Adultery is treason against the family, and God hates it." But this is not the only way to break up, to break this moral law of God. Remember our interpretation rule number 4, which states that each commandment stands for a whole category of sins. This command is no different. By implication, this command rules out many other lesser sins that lead up to adultery. For instance, this process often begins with many sorts of inappropriate intimacy. Seeking various kinds of support, emotionally or otherwise, can lead to problems and temptations. Ephesians, Paul writes, chapter 5, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church." Jesus would never flirt with another bride or someone else that would cause him to be tempted, and we shouldn't do this. We should not do that either. The rule of categories also rules out other forms of sexual immorality. The Greek Septuagint, as well as many passages in the Greek New Testament, use a word porneia, porneia. With it comes a whole bunch of meanings: adultery, fornication, premarital sex, homosexuality, bestiality, incest, and even the ancient form of idol worship, which was along this same line. In the Old Testament, God often compared this relationship with his relationship with his people to the romance between a husband and wife. Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 9, "I also swore to you and entered into a covenant with you so that you became mine, declared the Lord." And in Isaiah chapter 54, verse 5, God tells Israel, "For your husband is your maker, whose name is the Lord of hosts." And when Israel forsook God for idols, for the idols around them, they were called adulterers. And even Hosea was told to mimic what Israel did when God talks to him in chapter 1, verse 2. It says, "The Lord said to Hosea, go take a harlot for a wife and have children with the harlot, for the land of Israel has committed adultery to the Lord." So what God was telling him to do was to act like Israel. Go find someone else so that they'll get the message, because he was a prophet. The New Testament deepens the mystery of marriage by defining the relationship between Christ and the church as that of a husband and his bride. Revelation chapter 19. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, pure and bright. For the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. The bride talked about here is the church. She is dressed in fine linen and and this fine linen is her righteous deeds. F. LaGard Smith wrote a book titled "Baptism: The Believer's Wedding Ceremony," and in it he parallels the act of becoming a Christian to that of a wedding ceremony. And in a sense, when we say we kind of say "I do" to the contract when we go through the act of baptism, and that's the point of his book. Other rules for interpretation apply to this seventh commandment. First, we have the inside-outside rule. Stated another way, this commandment is internal as well as external. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 27, Jesus is on the Sermon on the Mount again. And he says, Jesus tells those at the Sermon on the Mount, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in her heart," in his heart, either one. Think about this. We've talked about this a couple times already, that we say we don't murder, we say we don't steal, we say we don't whatever one of the commandments, but the lesser commandments that apply to this, we have done. So basically that, as we've said before, makes us an adulterer and someone who steals and someone who murders, even though we don't look at it that way. And that's what Jesus is explaining in the Sermon on the Mount. As with the sixth commandment, don't murder, many think that Jesus was changing the seventh commandment by adding something when he says, "But I tell you." I do not believe that that's true. When Jesus makes the statement, "You have heard it said," he is not simply referring to what was written on stone. He was referring to how that commandment had been misinterpreted or not fully interpreted. Jesus pointed out many times how keeping the external works of the law was never what it was all about from the beginning. In Luke chapter 11, Jesus gives a series of woes designed to show just how much Israel had drifted from God's initial intent. Starting in verse 42, "Woe unto you, Pharisees! You pay tithes of mint, rue, and every herb, but you disregard justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." They were keeping the external parts of the law, but they ignored the internal parts as if they did not exist. Jesus is saying the same thing in Matthew 5 about what had been done to many of God's commandments. Yes, what we actually do is important, but how we think about what we do is just as important. God looks at the heart, and this is evident when we study the lives of such people as Saul and David side by side. Saul looked good to men on the outside, but David looked good to God on the inside. And that was a huge difference, and it still is today. Therefore, even the seventh commandment stands for more than just the act of adultery. It stands for a whole category of sins that lead up to adultery. And this is yet another reason why the law of Moses was so impossible to keep, and why grace should sound so good to a Christian once they become baptized. All right, that's the end of thou shalt not commit adultery. Any questions before we go into the next command? All right. Many of us remember Norman Rockwell and his renditions of America at a time when things seemed a bit simpler. In this painting, what do we got going on? We see the butcher is trying to get a few more ounces while the older lady is trying to pay a little less. Neither seemingly aware of what the other is doing. The painting is charming and it makes us chuckle. But on another level, both the butcher and the lady are guilty of violating the 8th commandment. Thou shalt not steal. All right. When I worked in the factory, there was a lot of guys that would leave at night. I worked second shift. Leave at night with things that they did not bring in the plant when they punched in, if you get my drift. I remember hearing about a guy that would leave the plant each night with a wheelbarrow full of waste products. Each night the guard would search through the load and then always ask him, what are you going to do with this stuff? And the guy would say, tell the guard that I'm depositing it over in the dump site. And finally, after 30 years of doing this, the guy was going to retire. So on his last day, when the guy was leaving the plant, for the last time, the guard asked him, I know you've been doing up to something. I know that you've been taking something out of this plant all these years, but I can't figure out what it is. What are you stealing? And the guy said, I'm stealing wheelbarrows. I don't know if that one's true. I worked with guys, though, that I knew personally at the grocery store when I was in high school. One guy took booze out the back door. Another guy took albums off the music rack. But the most creative thief that I ever knew that worked at the Babcock's IGA in Clio was a guy named Rod. When he was ready to go on his break, he would go around the store accumulating everything he needed for his lunch. So he'd go out to the chip rack and he'd open a bag of chips. He'd take out how many he wanted. He'd seal the back up, put it back on the rack. Then he would go to the bread aisle and he would open up a loaf of bread and he would take out a couple of slices, seal it back up. And then he would go to the condiments aisle. He would open a jar of mayo, take a scoop out, put the top back on. You get the idea. And it wasn't long before he had everything he needed for his sandwich and his whole lunch. He probably never stole a whole loaf of bread in his entire life, or an entire jar of mayo, unless, of course, you add up all the parts of all the different ones that he did over the years that he worked there. When it comes right down to it, most of us would never think of ourselves as thieves. But we might take something small like a slice of bread. Others might condemn Rod for taking, the kid for taking albums. That wasn't Rod, that was a different guy. Taking albums from the grocery store but would themselves get online and download music or videos or plagiarize materials to be used as their own. This would be an example, I think, of what Jesus said when he told the Pharisees they are not to notice the beam in their own eye while they're not noticing the beam in their own eye while they're at the same time are trying to take a speck out of someone else's. I'm going to play a video clip here right now, a little bit of background. This is Dennis Prager, and if anybody has ever heard of PragerU, this is the guy that is kind of ahead of it. Very interesting guy to listen to sometimes. He's Jewish. He does a lot of political commentary and some very practical things for the United States. But I thought that this short little 5-minute video that he's got on this commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," was interesting. So go ahead and start it, if you will.
A good case can be made that the 8th commandment, "Do not steal," is the one commandment that encompasses all the others. How does "do not steal" encompass the other commandments? Well, murder is the stealing of another person's life. Adultery is the stealing of another person's spouse. Coveting is the desire to steal what belongs to another person. Giving false testimony is stealing justice, and so on. This commandment is unique in another way. It is the only commandment that is completely open-ended. All the other commandments are specific. The 5th commandment, for example, states that it is our parents whom we should honor. The 6th commandment, prohibiting murder, is about taking the life of an innocent human being. The 7th commandment, prohibiting adultery, is also specific to a married person. Two unmarried people cannot commit adultery. But the commandment against stealing doesn't even hint at what it is we're forbidden to steal, which means that we cannot take anything that belongs to another person. And that, in turn, means 3 big things. First and foremost, the commandment against stealing has always been understood to mean that we are not allowed to steal another human being, what we call kidnapping. That is why no one who had even an elementary understanding of the 8th commandment could ever use the Bible to justify the most common form of slavery, the kidnapping of human beings and selling them into slavery. Critics of the Bible argue that the Bible allowed slavery, but the type of slavery described was in almost all cases what was known as indentured servitude, the selling of oneself to another person for a fixed period of time in order to work off a debt. This had nothing to do with kidnapping free people, such as was done in Africa and elsewhere. That was expressly forbidden by the 8th commandment. The second significant meaning of the commandment against stealing is the sanctity of people's property. Just as we are forbidden to steal people, we are forbidden to steal what people own. It has been shown over and over that private property, beginning with land ownership, is indispensable to creating a free and decent society. Every totalitarian regime takes away private property rights. In the ancient and medieval world, a few rich people owned all the land, and the majority of the population worked on that land for the enrichment of the owners. And then in 19th century Europe, many socialists argued for taking away private property and giving it to the quote-unquote people. Where that advice was followed, in what came to be known as the communist world, theft of property quickly resulted in theft of freedom and ultimately massive theft of life. The third enormously important meaning of the commandment against stealing concerns the many non-material things each person owns: their reputation, their dignity, their trust, and their intellectual property. Let's quickly run through these. 1. A person's reputation. Stealing a person's good name, whether through libel, slander, or gossip, is a particularly destructive form of theft because, unlike money or property, once a person's good name has been stolen, it can almost never be fully restored. 2. A person's dignity. The act of stealing a person's dignity is known as humiliation. And humiliating a person, especially in public, can do permanent damage to what is perhaps the most precious thing any of us owns, our dignity. 3, a person's trust. Stealing a person's trust is known as deceiving someone. In fact, in Hebrew, a term for tricking someone is gnevat da'at, which literally means stealing knowledge. One example is tricking people into buying something, as when a real estate agent omits telling a prospective purchaser all the flaws in a home in order to make a sale. Another example would be when someone deceives another person with insincere proclamations of love in order to obtain material or sexual favors. 4, a person's intellectual property. This form of theft includes anything from copying software or downloading music and movies without paying for them to stealing a person's words, what we know as plagiarism. Stealing a life, a person, a spouse, material property, intellectual property, a reputation, dignity, or trust. There is hardly any aspect of human life that is not harmed, sometimes irreparably so, by stealing. That is why it is fair to say that if everyone observed only one of the 10 commandments, observing the commandment, do not steal, would, all by itself, make a beautiful world. I'm Dennis Prager. Join Prager University. Subscribe.
Variety of meanings: burglary, robbery, larceny, hijacking, shoplifting, pickpocketing, embezzlement, extortion, racketeering are among the most common meanings, but it also has other meanings. This is only a partial list. Pilfering. One hotel a few years back reported that in its first year of operation, it had to replace 38,000 spoons, 18,000 tiles, 35 coffee pots, 100 or more Bibles, and countless towels. Employee theft of time and property costs American businesses more than $200 billion each year. And I think that's a few years old, so I think it's a lot more than that now. Some have estimated that 1/3 of the cost of the products that we buy goes to cover various forms of stealing that occur in various places up and down the supply chain. And large corporations commit a form of theft by keeping transactions in places where the government can't get to them. And governments themselves commit theft when they waste public money and run up enormous debts without some kind of way to come out of the deficit spending that they do. Indeed, the list of ways to break this commandment is long, and I think if each person looked at themselves today throughout the course of their lives, at some point or another, and probably multiple points, we would have broken this commandment. Whenever we take something that does not belong to us, however we do it, we not only sin against our neighbor, but we also sin against God. First, if you think about it, theft is a failure on our part to trust in God's provisions. In whatever way we take something that does not belong to us, we deny the fact that it is God that has given us everything that we need. In other words, keeping the 8th commandment demonstrates our faith in God's ability to provide. Not stealing is an exercise in our belief in God's providence and provision for ourselves. Second, theft is also an assault on God's provision for others. The second way that stealing is a sin against God is that it robs what he has already provided for someone else. The very idea of the eighth commandment assumes right of ownership. Mr. Prager made that clear, and it's true. If there were no private property, you couldn't steal. But you can steal, therefore there must be the acceptance of private property. The very fact that he said, "You shall not steal," lets us know that God has indicated people have the right to keep their own stuff. Otherwise, the whole idea of stealing makes no sense. The only reason that you can steal something at all is because there is private ownership involved. But we know that all things come from God. Adam probably did not have a temptation to steal because God had given him the whole earth to take care of. All of the gold, all of the precious stones, all of everything. Why? Why didn't he have this temptation? Because he was the only man on earth. And God had given him the responsibility to take care of all the earth's resources. Likewise today, what we have is on loan from God. And if he has entrusted it to one person, it is wrong for another person to assume that it is his to take care of. So, what might be the flip side of the commandment, "You shall not steal"? Hoarding or amassing goods and wealth for our own selfish purpose is also wrong. What is implied by ownership in the Bible is not possessing things for just our own personal use. What we receive from God is to be used for God's glory. Therefore, at the same time that we are forbidden to take things that belong to others, we are also required to use what we have been given in ways that are pleasing to the one that entrusted them to us. In other words, the eighth commandment is not just about stealing, it is also about stewardship. One of the parables of Jesus that is found in Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 14, was about a master and his servants and the talents that each of these servants were entrusted with while the master was away. A master is leaving town for an extended period of time and entrusts 3 of his servants with part of his wealth. The reading goes, whoops. You have the I'm missing some slides. There it is. I don't know why it flipped. Now where was I reading? Yeah, Matthew chapter 25, verse 4, starting in verse 14 or 15, I don't remember which. It says, to one he gave 5 talents, to another he gave 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. When he went away, he who had received 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he that had 2 talents made 2 talents more. But the one who had received 1 talent went out and dug a hole in the ground and hid it in the ground, hid his master's money. 2 of the servants used what the master had gave them wisely, but one did not. Instead, he hoards and hides what belongs to the master. Note, he did not take it. He did not what we think of as stealing it. In fact, he gives it back to the master when he is returned. It is this servant, the one that does not attempt to enhance what the master had entrusted to him with, that is condemned. What God gives us is not only meant for us, it is also meant for doing the master's business. Good stewardship is of utmost importance. We work to provide for our families, but we also are to assist in the provisions of others less fortunate. In Acts chapter 4, We see many Christians selling things that they had and giving the proceeds to the poor. In Acts chapter 4, it says, "There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of land or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what they sold and laid it at the feet of the apostles, and it was distributed to each as they had need." This act of helping others glorified God. Then in Acts chapter 5, we have a contrast to this. If you read those two chapters back to back in context, we have Ananias and Sapphira, on the other hand, wanting everyone to think that they were acting without being selfish, but instead of glorifying God, they were glorifying themselves. And they said that they brought their proceeds to the apostles, but they did not. And the result that they paid, the price that they paid was very heavy, if you remember the story. Deuteronomy chapter 15. Israel's told, "Give generously to them," talking about the poor, if you follow the context of the passage. "Give generously to the poor and do so without a grudging heart. Then, because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything he puts in your hands." Or he puts your hands to, you put your hands to. Think about this. Right there, we have an explanation or a commentary, so to speak, on "thou shalt not steal." It furthers it in other places in the Old Testament, so they should have picked this up as they went through. In the New Testament, likewise, Paul says in 2 Corinthians, starting chapter 9, starting in 7, "Let each one," and this is from the Amplified Bible, so it's rather wordy, but I think it's a good translation of this. "Let each one thoughtfully and with purpose, just as he has decided in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver," and can't say that word 3 times fast. Can't even say it once. "And delights in the one whose heart is in the gift." And Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be also." As we have already discussed, it is nearly impossible to keep the law of Moses perfectly. And for many, the 8th commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," is one of the more difficult. There are many ways in which to steal that do not involve robbing a bank or stealing a wheelbarrow in plain sight. In other ways, in one way or another, I can pretty much be assured that all of us have broken this commandment at some point and at various points in our lives. As it says in James chapter 2, starting in verse 10, "For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it," which, if you think about it, makes the idea of grace way more desirable. Any questions on that? Wow, either you guys are sleeping or I'm doing a better job than I thought. Anything? Okay, thanks. We're done. Yeah.